I'm going to be showing you the 10 medieval manuscripts that are in the Wollaton Library collection. They are probably just a small fragment of what was originally in the medieval library. These are all that have survived through the ages for us. They're quite an eclectic mix. They cover 4 centuries and they're written in 4 different languages, despite there only being 10 items. So that's really quite remarkable. 2 of the most early items in the collection are volumes of stories written in French. We think that they were both written in the early half of the 13th century, so that's maybe somewhere around 1220, 1240. The first book that we're going to look at is a volume of French fables and romances. So it's a collection of stories in one book. It's written in a northern French dialect. It's a marvellous book because it's illustrated. It's probably one of the earliest examples of an illustrated volume in French. The pictures are absolutely glorious. They're miniatures, very small illustrations that are illuminated in gold leaf and coloured pigments. And in most cases, they seem to illustrate the story. They show particular characters that are being talked about in the story. But there are others which are grotesques, representations of mythical animals, beasts, heads. So there's quite a mix of illustrations in there, and researchers find those very interesting. There is one unique story in this manuscript, in the collection of stories. It's a story called Le Roman de Silence, and it was written by an author called Hildris de Cornwall. The version that we have in our volume of French romances and fabuleux is the only one that is known of in the whole world. Most of the other stories in the volume are known of in other editions, so our volume can be compared with other editions in other libraries. But Le Roman de Silence is completely unique and has attracted a lot of attention from scholars because of that fact. It was transcribed and translated by one of our own members of the university staff, Lewis Thorpe, in the 1960s and 70s, and became known to a wide audience. But we hope that the work that we've done in the Heritage Loss Refund project will make it more available to other scholars to do more work on it, and indeed on the other stories in the collection. The second French volume in the collection is a book called L'Histoire de Saint Grail, the history of the Holy Grail. It was already well known. There are other editions available in other libraries. So what we need to do when we are cataloguing and finding out more about these volumes is to see what other editions are available, see if we can match it in, see if it fits. So we would compare the lines and the verses to see if they match. In our case, the version of the history of the Holy Grail that we hold is only a partial copy. There's about half of it, and the other half is missing. So we're able to work with the other editions to work out exactly where the break happens, so that we know that we have the second half of the story and not the first. The word Lancelot appears just above the mark there. Here's the word Camelot on the page. Camer on this line, and then it continues over into the next line. Allot, camer, allot. We have another volume in the collection which is a work of narrative in verse. The 2 French volumes are also very long poems, long narrative poems. And that tradition, that way of writing literature, continued on into the later medieval period, but the language changed. So we have a volume by the English poet John Gower, which was written in English in the late 14th century. The volume that we have was written in the early 15th century. It was a tale that was already well known when this particular volume was written. It's a very beautifully made volume. Pages of parchment are big and regular with large margins. There are indications in the text that it would have been illuminated and illustrated. It should have had illuminated capital initials, and there is space left for them. They were never drawn in. The only illustration that we have in the book are things almost like doodles. There's a leaf here which was drawn in to cover up a blemish in the parchment. There's a hole there that's in the parchment, and then a section here which might have been made into a hole, might have gone into a hole, but it's not quite. So the parchment is blemished, and the person writing out the book has drawn a doodle in a kind of leaf shape to cover it up. And it's mirrored on the other side of the page by the same shaped blemish, but this time somebody's drawn in a picture of a pig to cover up the shape, and there's another one below it which there is debate over what kind of creature this is supposed to represent. This is a small group of devotional books, books to help contemplate religious life and religious behaviour and moral behaviour. They were quite common after 1215, when it became the law and practice that every member of a congregation had to confess to their parish priest once a year. So there are manuals for priests on how to handle that, and manuals that lay people could read to understand a bit more about what sinning was and what behaviour you might have engaged in that might be sinful, that you needed to confess to your priest. We have 2 volumes here which are written in Anglo-Norman. The aristocracy that came over with William the Conqueror were French, were Northern French, so they brought their own language with them. It altered a little bit during the course of the centuries in England, so we call it Anglo-Norman rather than French. It has similarities, but it's a different dialect. This volume contains 2 stories bound together. The first is Le Miroir, Mirror, by Robert de Greetham, a series of sermons in verse. So it runs through the chronology of the Christian year and goes into a bit more detail about the gospel stories that you would hear at that time of the year in church. The other volume is Le Manuel des Péchés, the Manual of Sins. That's a book which goes into a lot of different sinning behaviour, illustrates it with stories, and gives advice on what might happen to you in hell or in purgatory if you'd committed that particular sin. This is a book called Speculum Vitae. It has a Latin title, but it's actually written in English. And it's a volume giving advice on how to live your life by Christian principles. The page that I have opened here is one of the pages that goes into detail about the 10 Commandments and what they mean and how you should live by them. The title at the top of the page in Latin reads De Decem Preceptis. 8 of the 10 Wollaton Library Collection manuscripts are volumes, bound volumes, even if they don't now have their binding. But 2 of them are simple fragments, single leaves of books that we don't now have the rest of. The earlier one is from the South English Legendary, which is a book of stories all about saints' lives, and it was written in the 13th century. The fragment that we have is about St. Bridget of Ireland. We think that the fragment was used as a binding structure in a missal owned by Henry Willoughby in 1520. So it seems likely that the book that it had come from had been torn up, decided they didn't want to use it anymore, and were reusing the fragments of it to bind other things. Just one of the items is on paper instead of parchment. That's a fragment, just one single leaf, from a book about saints, and it's about a saint called Zita, who's better known in English as Sitha or Sith. She was an Italian woman, a servant, a household servant, well known for her piety and good deeds. Next we have a prayer book written in England in the 15th century in Latin, It may have been used in the home for private devotions. It may have been used in a church. It has some shields at the back depicting heraldry of particular families, but it's been quite difficult to work out exactly who the families are and how they may relate to the book. But it does seem to have been handled by families, by people, rather than by a church or an institution. It contains prayers to saints who were well known in the local areas of East Anglia and the East Midlands. And it contains a prayer to St Zitha, who we've already met in another document. So that's really lovely. It ties up, and it shows the whole combined nature of medieval culture, that things in one book could be mentioned in another. This volume is possibly the earliest in the collection. It dates to the late 12th century or the early 13th century, so somewhere between 1175 and 1225, say. It's a breviary, so it's a service book that would have been used in church, and in fact you can tell this because of the musical notation that appears throughout. It represents anthems that would have been sung in church by priests. We've really been able to look at the volumes in detail and end up knowing so much more about them than we did before. And to be able to communicate what we've learnt about the volumes to a wider public, and hopefully to a wider public than simply the academics who had been able to work on them before. We've created a web resource called Wives, Widows and Wimples on our Manuscripts and Special Collections website, which is aimed at anybody who's interested in medieval culture. We've included snippets from each of the manuscripts, but they have been transcribed and also translated, so you don't need to know any medieval languages to understand a little bit about what each of the volumes are about. And of course the digital images that have been created as part of the project enable people to appreciate the volumes as beautiful works of art, even if they don't understand the content.